The day I turned off the water to my entire neighborhood, Brenda Kravitz's prize-winning petunias were the first to go. It's a shame, really. They were a truly offensive shade of pink, the kind of color you only see in Pepto-Bismol and ill-advised bridesmaid dresses. Let me back up. This whole suburban war didn't start with a bang, but with a simple, wholesome dream. Apples. And maybe a pear or two. My name is Alex, and until about a year ago, my life was a quiet monument to beige. I'm a software engineer, which is a polite way of saying I spend 10 hours a day staring at cascading lines of text, turning caffeine into code that helps a company in Delaware sell slightly more novelty socks. I'd spent a decade in the digital mines, and my greatest physical achievement was swapping out the office toner cartridge without getting any on my hands. I bought a house in a subdivision called Harmony Meadows, a name so aggressively pleasant it could only have been conceived by a committee. It had a decent-sized backyard, a 2-car garage, and was located on a street named Whispering Breeze Lane. It was the American dream, or at least a reasonably priced facsimile. But a man cannot live on code alone. I needed something real, something tangible. I needed a hobby that didn't involve a screen or a blinking cursor. My grandfather, a man whose hands were mapped with the calluses of a life well lived, had a small orchard on his farm in upstate New York. I spent summers there as a kid, lost among the trees, the air thick with the smell of blossoms in the spring and ripe fruit in the fall. The memory was a little slice of heaven I kept tucked away in the back of my mind. Now, with a backyard of my own, a perfect, sun-drenched quarter-acre canvas, I decided it was time to paint my own masterpiece. This wasn't some whim. I am, by trade and by nature, a planner. A meticulous, borderline obsessive planner. I spent weeks researching. I dove into the world of pomology with the same fervor I usually reserved for a complex coding problem. I learned about rootstocks and grafting, about chill hours and soil pH. I selected specific varieties: Honeycrisp for their explosive crunch, Granny Smith for pies, a Bosc pear for its elegant shape, and a mystery heirloom apple called the Black Oxford, mostly because it sounded cool. I planned for dwarf trees, maxing out at a respectable 8 feet, ensuring I wouldn't be casting a shadow over anyone's prize-winning gnome collection. I designed a drip irrigation system that would be more water efficient than the neighborhood's asthmatic, rusty sprinklers. My plan was beautiful. It was thoughtful. It was, I believed, utterly unobjectionable. All I needed was the blessing of the Harmony Meadows Homeowners Association. I drafted a proposal complete with diagrams, a list of tree species with their maximum height and spread, and a summary of the environmental benefits. It looked like a NASA mission plan for a fruit expedition. I laminated the cover sheet. Laminated it! I figured I'd show up, present my case, they'd be charmed by my horticultural diligence, and I'd be planting by the weekend. I was so naive. The HOA meeting was held in Brenda Kravitz's garage. The air was thick with the smell of fertilizer and self-importance. Brenda, the president of our little suburban Politburo, had converted her 2-car garage into a command center. One wall was covered in a massive corkboard pinned with violation notices and architectural plans. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where Brenda sat, flanked by her treasurer, a perpetually nervous man named Gary. Brenda Kravitz was a woman forged in the fires of petty tyranny. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of blonde hair so rigidly hairsprayed it looked like it could deflect small arms fire. She wore a beige pantsuit that screamed, "I am sensible, therefore I am correct." In front of her, next to a stack of bylaws thick enough to stop a door, was a novelty oversized BBQ mallet she used as a gavel. The sheer, unadulterated tackiness of it was breathtaking. "The meeting of the Harmony Meadows HOA is now in session," she declared, bringing the barbecue mallet down with a dull thud that rattled a nearby jar of screws. First on the agenda, new business, Mr. Henderson. She looked at her paper as if my name was a complex algebraic equation. It's Alex, actually, I said, standing up and giving what I hoped was a charming, non-threatening smile. I launched into my presentation. I was passionate. I was eloquent. I spoke of biodiversity and the simple joy of growing one's own food. I showed them my laminated diagrams. I was, I must admit, magnificent. When I finished, there was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Brenda stared at me, her lips pursed into a thin, bloodless line. It was the look of a woman who had just been served a fly in her soup. "Thank you for your presentation, Alexander," she said, the word presentation dripping with condescension. "While your passion is noted, the Architectural Review Committee has reviewed your proposal." She said this as if the committee were a council of wise elders and not just her and Gary drinking iced tea on her patio. "We have determined that a personal orchard does not align with the pre-approved landscaping palettes for Harmony Meadows." I blinked. "Landscaping palettes? Brenda, they're trees. Small trees. They have lovely white and pink flowers in the spring. They're beautiful. What's not to like?" Gary, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat and chimed in, his voice a reedy echo of Brenda's authority. "The bylaws are very clear, Alex. Section 4, subsection B, paragraph 3. All flora must be primarily ornamental in nature. Fruit," he said, looking at Brenda for approval, "is utilitarian." Utilitarian? The word hung in the air, smelling faintly of mothballs and defeat. "It's an apple. An apple is a thing of beauty. It's the star of countless fairy tales. Are your prize-winning roses not utilitarian for attracting bees? Or is their only utility satisfying your ego?" A gasp rippled through the small collection of neighbors in attendance. I had gone off script. Brenda's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the garage dropped 10 degrees. "Mr. Henderson, we are not here to debate the philosophical nature of fruit. We are here to uphold the standards that maintain our property values. An orchard, as you call it, implies a certain agricultural aesthetic. It brings pests. It attracts vermin. The falling fruit will be an unsightly mess. What's next? A chicken coop? A goat?" "I'm not planning on raising livestock, Brenda," I shot back, my voice tighter than I wanted. "I just want to grow a few apples. For personal consumption. I'm not turning my backyard into a commercial farm." "The bylaws are the bylaws," she said with an air of finality, picking up her mallet. "The committee's decision is to deny the request. All in favor of upholding the denial?" Brenda's hand shot up. Gary's followed a second later, like a startled meerkat. The third board member, a guy who apparently only showed up for the Christmas party, was absent. "Motion carries," Brenda declared, banging the BBQ mallet with triumphant finality. "Next item." I stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. I had been dismissed. My beautiful, laminated, well-researched dream had been crushed by a woman wielding a novelty gavel in a garage that smelled faintly of gasoline. I walked out of there, my face burning with a righteous fury I hadn't felt since my internet went out during the season finale of a show I really liked. I was in my backyard, staring at the offending patch of lush, green, entirely fruitless grass, nursing a beer and my wounded pride. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Harmony Meadows. It was all so neat, so orderly, so sterile. "Let me guess," a voice said from over the fence. "You met the dragon lady." I turned to see my next-door neighbor, Sarah, leaning against the fence post. Sarah was a graphic designer in her 40s, with a streak of purple in her dark hair, and a perpetually amused glint in her eye. She was holding a glass of red wine. "She called my apples utilitarian," I said, the word tasting like ash. "I feel like I need to wash my mouth out with soap." Sarah let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, you got the utilitarian speech? That's a classic." She hit me with whimsical when I wanted to paint my front door teal. Apparently, our doors are only allowed to be shades of dignified neutrality. I ended up with grage. It's the color of despair. We stood there in shared silence for a moment. Two soldiers in the same pointless war. "She'll never back down, you know," Sarah said, taking a sip of her wine. "The no is the whole point. It's the source of her power." I looked at my empty yard, then back at Brenda's perfectly illuminated house down the street. A flicker of an idea, formless and chaotic, sparked in my mind. Brenda wanted a war of attrition. She wanted me to give up, to surrender to the tyranny of beige and plant some soulless, HOA-approved azaleas. Fine, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I once spent 3 days debugging a single line of rogue code that was causing a 1-cent rounding error in a financial report. My patience and my pettiness were, as yet, an untapped natural resource. "She picked the wrong fight," I said, my voice low. "I'm getting my orchard." Sarah raised her glass. "To whimsical rebellions and utilitarian fruit," she toasted. "Godspeed, you magnificent bastard." The weeks that followed were a blur of frustrating dead ends. I wrote a formal appeal letter, citing the emotional distress caused by a lack of homegrown fruit. It was denied. I tried to rally the neighbors, but most of them were either too scared of Brenda or too deeply apathetic to care. "It's just some trees, man," one guy told me while polishing his oversized pickup truck. "Just let it go." Let it go? Oh no. Letting it go was not in my nature. My grandfather didn't raise a quitter, and my career in IT didn't train me to accept a system that was clearly broken. When a system is broken, you don't just walk away. You find a back door. You find an exploit. So, I did what I do best. I started to dig. Not in my yard, but in the digital archives of our town's public records. I downloaded every document related to the Harmony Meadows subdivision I could find. Zoning permits, development charters, CC and Rs from every decade since the 70s. I was a man possessed, fueled by black coffee and pure, unadulterated spite. My work-from-home job became a convenient cover for my new obsession. I'd have a Zoom meeting about quarterly projections on one monitor while scrolling through decades-old property deeds on the other. Most of it was boilerplate legalese, a dense forest of heretofores and notwithstandings. But then, late one Tuesday night around 2 a.m., I found it. It wasn't in the HOA's governing documents. It was buried deep in the original plat map for the subdivision, filed with the county in 1978. It was a single, cryptic, beautiful sentence, written in the faded cursive of a long-dead surveyor. It read, "All irrigation and common area water rights for the Harmony Meadows subdivision are drawn from the pre-existing agricultural water rights tied to Parcel 7B. My heart started to pound. Water rights. It sounded so biblical. So, Old West. I half expected a grizzled prospector to show up and pan for gold in Brenda's birdbath. What did it mean? I did a quick search on Parcel 7B. It was the original designation for the huge tract of farmland that had been carved up to create Harmony Meadows. My house, Sarah's house, Brenda's house. We were all just little slivers of the old Parcel 7B. But who owned the water rights now? I kept digging. The original developer, a company called Sunnyside Estates, Inc., had gone spectacularly bankrupt during the recession of the early 1980s. Their assets were liquidated, sold off in a chaotic auction. The land was sold to new builders. The model homes were sold to families. But the water rights? They seem to have been bundled up with a bunch of other miscellaneous assets and sold for pennies on the dollar to an obscure holding company based in Delaware. And as far as I could tell, that's where they had sat for the last 40 years, untouched, forgotten, and most importantly, unused. A slow, maniacal grin spread across my face. The HOA had been watering their precious common area lawns, filling the community pond, and keeping Brenda's offensive petunias hydrated for decades, and they didn't even own the water. They were squatters. They had been using it for so long, no one ever thought to question it. It was like finding a car with the keys in it and driving it around for half your life. That didn't make it your car. Could this be it? Could I, Alex Henderson, disgruntled software engineer and aspiring apple farmer, become a suburban water baron? The idea was so magnificently, so diabolically petty, it felt like it was glowing on my screen. This was no longer about apples. This was about justice. This was about striking a blow against petty tyrants everywhere. But I was out of my depth. I could debug code, but I couldn't navigate the murky waters of pre-1914 appropriative rights. I needed a guide. I needed a lawyer. My search for agricultural water rights lawyer led me to a website that looked like it had been designed in 1999 and never updated. It featured a pixelated dancing hamster in the corner and a font that could only be described as Digital Cowboy. The lawyer's name was Silas Sly Croft. It was either an elaborate joke or the man was an absolute legend. I prayed for the latter. Sly's office was in an old, dusty building downtown, sandwiched between a bail bondsman and a vape shop. The man himself was even better than I had imagined. He was probably in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair, a weathered face, and a turquoise bolo tie. He sat behind a desk so cluttered with papers, books, and what looked like Native American pottery that I could barely see him. He listened to my story with a patient, grandfatherly air, nodding slowly as I laid out the whole saga. The apples, the HOA, Brenda, the utilitarian comment, the discovery in the Platte map. When I finished, he leaned back in his creaky leather chair, and a slow, wide grin spread across his face, revealing a gold tooth. "An HOA, you say?" he drawled, his voice a gravelly mix of Texas and wisdom. "Bunch of little tin gods in orthopedic shoes, running around with their little rulers measuring blades of grass. They think their homeowner's manual is the Constitution. Oh, I love it." He confirmed my suspicions. In our state, water rights were a form of property, just like land. They could be bought, sold, and inherited entirely separately from the dirt they flowed under. "Son," he said, leaning forward, his eyes twinkling with professional glee. "That developer, Sunnyside, they were smart. They bought the farm, which came with what we call senior water rights, some of the oldest and most powerful in the county. When they chopped up the land, they held on to the water rights like an ace up their sleeve. But when they went belly up, that ace got lost in the shuffle." He explained that the holding company in Delaware probably had no idea what they even owned. They likely saw it on a balance sheet as miscellaneous agricultural asset, Parcel 7B, and assumed it was for a dried-up creek bed in the middle of nowhere. "So," I asked, my voice barely a whisper, "can I buy them?" Sly Croft leaned back and let out a hearty laugh. "Buy 'em? Son, for the right price, you can buy anything. The real question is, what do you plan to do once you own the well?" The negotiation was a masterclass in legal maneuvering, handled entirely by Sly. He treated it like a high-stakes poker game, and I got a running commentary via a series of delightful phone calls. "Just got off the phone with him," he'd say, the crackle of the line making him sound even more like a character from an old Western. "Bunch of slick-haired fellas in New York City who sound like they're about 25. They thought these rights were for a swamp in Florida. I told them my client was a sentimental old fool looking to honor his grandpappy's dream of raising catfish. The holding company, eager to clear a worthless asset off their books, bit. The price they quoted was substantial. It would mean draining a significant portion of my savings, the money I'd diligently put away for a down payment on a bigger house someday, or a sports car, or a comfortable retirement. I hesitated for a whole 10 seconds. Then I thought of Brenda's smug face and her BBQ mallet gavel. "Do it," I told Sly. A week later, I was sitting in Sly's office, signing a stack of papers that transferred the ownership of pre-1914 senior appropriative water rights for historical parcel 7B to one Alex Henderson. I held the new deed in my hands. It was my Excalibur, my Declaration of Independence. I was now, legally speaking, a water baron, a suburban water baron. My kingdom was a quarter-acre plot with a patchy lawn, and my subjects were a bunch of passive-aggressive neighbors and one very angry woman with a penchant for petunias. It was the dumbest, most glorious thing I had ever done. Owning the water was one thing. Wielding that power was another. I couldn't just march over to the main valve and shut it off. That would be crude. My revenge, like a fine wine or a perfectly grown apple, needed to mature. It needed style. It needed to be a slow, torturous burn. The first step was to bait the dragon out of her cave. On Sly's advice, I needed to establish a pretext, a plausible reason for messing with the neighborhood's water infrastructure, so I hired contractors. I found a local company online called Dirt Dogs Landscaping. Their logo was a bulldog in a hard hat. It felt appropriately absurd. The next morning, a loud, rumbling truck pulled up, and out stepped Rico and Vince. Rico was the front man. He was short, wiry, and crackled with a nervous energy that suggested he'd had about 12 cups of coffee. He talked a mile a minute, gesticulating wildly with his hands. Vince, his cousin, was the exact opposite. He was a mountain of a man with a thick beard and arms like tree trunks. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy and communicated almost exclusively in grunts and nods. "All right, boss," Rico said, clapping me on the back like we were old friends. "Rico and Vince at your service. The Dirt Dogs are here to make your landscaping dreams a reality. So what are we doing? Fountains, a koi pond, a lazy river? You say the word, Vince and me. We can make it happen. We got a guy for flamingos, both plastic and, for a little extra, the real deal." I smiled. No, much simpler. I just need you to dig a trench. Right here," I said, pointing to a spot in my side yard, conveniently located near the property line and in direct view of Brenda's front window. "And over there," I pointed to the end of the trench, "I need you to install a large industrial-looking valve handle." Rico squinted, his stream of chatter finally slowing. "A valve handle? To what?" "To the future," I said with a cryptic smile. Vince grunted, which Rico translated. "He says it's your money." They set to work. Within an hour, my pristine lawn was a mess of dirt piles and a deep, ominous-looking trench. Vince operated the mini backhoe with surprising delicacy, while Rico supervised with the intensity of a general directing a battle. The sight of heavy machinery in Harmony Meadows was like a shark sighting at a public pool. It didn't take long. Brenda Kravitz appeared as if summoned by the roar of the engine. She marched across her lawn, her face a thundercloud of fury. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You are not approved for any excavation. This is a clear violation of Section 6 concerning landscape alterations." I had been waiting for this moment. I casually leaned on a shovel, trying to look as nonchalant as possible. "Relax, Brenda," I said, giving her my most reassuring smile. "It's not a landscape alteration. It's just some routine plumbing work, making sure my water pressure is up to code. You know how it is." "Plumbing for what?" she snapped, gesturing at the giant, pointless hole in my yard. "For my personal water management system," I said, pulling the term out of thin air. "It's very important to manage one's water." She wasn't buying it. "I am writing you up for this, Alexander. You'll be receiving a fine and a cease and desist order." She spun on her heel and marched back to her house, no doubt to begin drafting her angry letter on official HOA letterhead. Phase 1 was complete. The bait was set. Now, it was time to make it official. That evening, with Sarah providing moral support and wine, I drafted my masterpiece. It wasn't a letter, it was a legal declaration. On heavy bond paper, using a formal, dispassionate tone I copied from legal templates online, I composed a notice to the Harmony Meadows Homeowners Association. "You should add, 'So help you God' at the end," Sarah suggested, peering over my shoulder. "Too aggressive," I said, typing carefully. "The beauty of this is that I'm being perfectly, legally, reasonably terrifying. I'm not the bad guy here. I'm just a concerned water baron conducting a systems audit." The final letter was a thing of beauty. It politely informed the board that as the legal owner of record for all water rights associated with Parcel 7B, I would be commencing a full-scale audit of the irrigation infrastructure. To facilitate this audit, all non-essential water usage drawn from these rights would be suspended indefinitely, effective 8 a.m. Friday morning. That gave them 72 hours. I printed 3 copies, put one in an envelope, and drove to the post office. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested. The small fee was worth every penny for the sheer satisfaction of knowing Brenda would have to personally sign for the delivery of her own doom. For the next 2 days, an uneasy quiet fell over the neighborhood. My giant red valve handle, which Rico and Vince had installed on a concrete slab, stood like a surrealist sculpture in my yard. It was connected to absolutely nothing, but it looked incredibly official. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me as I watered my own small flower bed with a hose. They knew something was up. The rumor mill was churning. The certified letter arrived at Brenda's house on Thursday afternoon. I know this because I was coincidentally checking my own mail at the time and saw the postal worker walk up her driveway. I imagined the scene vividly. Brenda, annoyed at the interruption, signing the little green slip, tearing open the envelope, her eyes scanning the first few lines with confusion, then widening in dawning horror, and finally settling into a state of pure, incandescent rage. The police arrived at 4:15 p.m. I was expecting them. A black and white squad car rolled silently down Whispering Breeze Lane and pulled up to my curb. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a thick mustache and a weary, seen-it-all look in his eyes. The other was younger, fitter, and had a more intense, by-the-book demeanor. Brenda was already on the sidewalk, phone in hand, pointing at my house with the dramatic flair of a silent film star. "That's him, officers!" she cried, as I walked down my driveway to meet them. "That's the man! He's threatening to destroy our property! He's trying to steal our water!" The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, sighed a sigh so profound it seemed to carry the weight of every ridiculous suburban dispute he'd ever been called to. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "Is he actively stealing water right now? Is he out here with a bucket?" "Good afternoon, officers," I said calmly, cutting in before Brenda could launch into another tirade. I was holding a neat folder. "Alex Henderson, I believe I'm the reason you're here." I handed Officer Miller the folder. "In here, you'll find a copy of my property deed for the water rights in question, filed and recorded with the county clerk's office. You'll also find a copy of the official notice I sent to the HOA. As you can see, I'm simply planning a routine maintenance check on my own property." The younger officer, Davies, looked from me to Brenda, utterly confused. But Miller's eyes scanned the deed, his eyebrows raising slightly. He was a veteran. He understood what a civil matter was. He looked up from the paper, over at my ridiculous valve handle, and then back at me. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Son," he said, lowering the folder, "are you telling me you bought the water?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "Lock, stock, and barrel." Officer Miller let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." He turned to Brenda, his entire demeanor shifting to one of official boredom. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the documents. This is a civil dispute. It's a disagreement over property. It's not a criminal matter. We can't arrest a man for planning to turn off a tap that he legally owns." Brenda sputtered. But the lawns, our property values, he's a menace." "That's something you'll have to take up with your lawyers," Miller said, handing my folder back to me. He tipped his hat ever so slightly. "Have a good day, sir." He turned to his partner. "Come on, Davies. Let's go find some actual crime." As they got back in their car, Miller caught my eye and gave me a subtle, appreciative nod. It was the universal sign for, "You magnificent bastard." They drove away, leaving me on my driveway and Brenda on the sidewalk, utterly, gloriously defeated. The last line of defense had fallen. The countdown had begun. The final 24 hours were a strange mix of terror and glee. I was a man on the eve of his own self-made apocalypse. The neighborhood was buzzing with a nervous energy. I saw neighbors huddled on street corners, whispering. Some shot me angry glares as they drove by. Others, the ones who had their own war stories about Brenda, gave me discreet little thumbs-ups. Sarah texted me a picture of a glass of wine with the caption, "T-8 hours. The world wonders." I won't lie, I had a moment of doubt. I was standing in my kitchen, looking out at my yard, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. Was this too much? Was I becoming the villain in my own story? This had started as a simple, wholesome dream about apple trees. Now I was on the verge of turning a whole neighborhood into a dust bowl, all because of a grudge. Then I pictured Brenda's smug, dismissive face in that garage. I heard her voice dripping with condescension as she called my dream utilitarian. I thought of her BBQ mallet gavel coming down like a sentence, and the doubt evaporated. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was for every person who'd ever been shut down by a petty tyrant on a power trip. This was for Sarah's greige door. This was for the soul of Whispering Breeze Lane. At 7 p.m., my doorbell rang. It was Brenda and Gary, a final, desperate diplomatic mission. Gary looked pale and sweaty. Brenda had plastered on a tight, vaguely conciliatory smile that didn't reach her cold, furious eyes. "Alex," Gary began, his voice trembling slightly, "we're asking you to be reasonable. The lawns. Think of the property values. The Harmony Meadows entrance display just won second place in the Regional Garden Club competition." Brenda cut him off. "This is your last chance, Alexander," she said, her voice low and strained. "Turn back from this madness. Cease this campaign of terror. If you do, the board is prepared to reconsider. We can discuss a variance for one small crabapple tree. Maybe. In the back corner of your yard." I almost laughed. A single, pathetic crabapple tree. It was the most insulting peace offering I had ever heard. "Brenda, the time for negotiation was before you called my life's passion a nuisance," I said, my voice calm and steady. "The deadline is 8 a.m. tomorrow. I'd suggest you all invest in watering cans." I closed the door on their shocked faces. There was no turning back now. The morning of the reckoning dawned bright and clear. A perfect day for a drought. At 7:55 a.m., I walked out my front door. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors stood on their lawns or on the sidewalk across the street, a safe distance away, as if I were about to handle radioactive material. Brenda was there, of course, standing on the edge of her lawn, phone held up, recording for posterity. Gary stood beside her, wringing his hands. On her porch, Sarah gave me a slow, deliberate nod, coffee mug in hand. I walked over to the magnificent, ridiculous, bright red valve handle that Rico and Vince had installed. It was my scepter, my crown jewel. It was connected, via a cleverly hidden series of pipes just beneath the sod, to the actual 40-year-old master shutoff valve for the entire neighborhood's common area irrigation system. I took a deep breath. The air was still. The only sound was the gentle chuck-chusk-chusk of dozens of sprinkler heads, all blissfully unaware of their impending doom. I grabbed the cool metal of the handle with both hands. It was stiff from decades of disuse. I planted my feet and pulled. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, groaning shriek of protesting metal that echoed down the silent street, the valve began to turn. It was hard work. I had to put my entire body into it, straining against 40 years of rust and neglect. It turned slowly, fighting me every inch of the way. And then, with a final, shuddering clunk, it settled into its new, closed position. And then, silence. A profound, unnatural quiet descended upon Harmony Meadows. The rhythmic hissing of the sprinklers was gone. One by one, the graceful arcs of water faltered, sputtered, and died. The sprinkler heads on the pristine green belts, the ones nourishing the flower beds by the grand entrance sign, the ones feeding Brenda's award-winning, offensively pink petunia patch, they all choked and went still. Brenda let out a small, horrified gasp. It was the only sound. I stood there for a moment, my hands on my hips, breathing heavily from the exertion, the king of my very dry kingdom. In the sudden quiet, you could hear a pin drop, or, more accurately, you could hear the last few drops of water dribbling out of a sprinkler head onto Brenda Kravitz's now doomed petunias. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The first few days were a novelty. People watered their own front yards with hoses, creating little green oases in a sea of municipal brown. But my target was never their personal lawns. It was the common areas, the vast, thirsty stretches of greenbelt that the HOA fees were supposed to maintain. Those were Brenda's pride and joy. And they were dying. By the end of the first week, the transformation was dramatic. The lush emerald turf that lined Whispering Breeze Lane began to fade to a sickly yellow-green. By day 10, it was the color of straw. The flowers at the entrance wilted, their heads bowed in surrender. And Brenda's petunias. They were a shriveled, tragic memory, their brown, crispy leaves a testament to my victory. The mood in the neighborhood began to shift. The initial anger directed at me started to curdle and redirect itself toward a more deserving target, the HOA. Why had they let this happen? Why was one man allowed to hold the entire neighborhood hostage? Why didn't they have a contract for the water they'd been using for free for 40 years? The questions got louder at the community mailboxes and in the neighborhood Facebook group. Brenda's power, which was built on the illusion of total control, was evaporating under the hot summer sun. The Emperor had no clothes, and her lawn was turning to dust. An emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Wednesday. This time it wasn't in Brenda's garage. It was moved to the small community clubhouse, the one usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties. And this time everyone showed up. The room was packed, a standing-room-only crowd of angry, confused, and dehydrated-looking homeowners. I attended, of course. I took a seat in the back, content to observe the fireworks. Brenda, looking haggard and defeated, tried to run the meeting, but she had lost the room. People were shouting questions, demanding answers. Gary looked like he was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. Finally, a man from the next street over stood up. "Brenda, this is a disaster. My mother-in-law is visiting next month. What is she going to think? The place looks abandoned. What are you going to do about him?" He pointed a finger at me in the back of the room. All eyes turned to me. The room fell silent. This was my moment. I stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room. I didn't gloat, I didn't say, "I told you so." I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. "I never wanted this," I said, my voice even and reasonable. "I just wanted to plant some apple trees. This was never about the water. It was about being told I couldn't do something harmless and perfectly reasonable on my own property. It was about an HOA board that cared more about power than about community." I let that hang in the air for a moment. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to solve this problem. For all of us. I laid out my terms. They were simple. I would sign a 99-year lease granting the Harmony Meadows HOA the use of the water rights for a nominal fee of $1 per year. In exchange, two things had to happen. First, the board would immediately and publicly approve my full original orchard plan. Second, they would draft and pass a new amendment to the bylaws. We would call it the Reasonable Projects Clause. It would state, in simple terms, that homeowner projects which do not materially or negatively affect neighbors or common property values cannot be unreasonably denied. It was a check on absolute power. A murmur went through the crowd. It was fair. It was more than fair. Brenda stood there, her face pale. She had no choice. Her reign was over. Someone made a motion to accept my terms. Someone else seconded it. Brenda, in a small, choked voice, had to call the vote. It was unanimous. She had been publicly, utterly, and democratically humbled. The next day, the great groan of the master valve being turned back on echoed through the neighborhood. The sprinklers sputtered back to life. A cheer went up from a few houses down the street. It took a few weeks, but slowly, life returned to the lawns of Harmony Meadows. Rico and Vince, the dirt dogs, returned to my yard. This time they weren't digging pointless trenches. They were helping me plant trees. "So you really did it, boss," Rico said, shaking his head in admiration as he and Vince carefully lowered a young Honeycrisp tree into a freshly dug hole. "You bought the water. That's a new one. Vince is real impressed." Vince grunted in affirmation, giving me a rare, almost smile. It's a year later now. I'm sitting on my back porch, looking out at my orchard. It's small, just 7 trees, but it's thriving. The leaves are green, the branches are reaching for the sun, and a few of them are dotted with the first promising blush of blossoms. Sarah leans over the fence, just like she did on that first day. "So, was it worth it?" she asks. "The savings account, the lawyers, the near anarchy." I look at my little kingdom. I reach over to a low-hanging branch on the black Oxford and pluck a small, early apple. It's not quite ready, but I can't resist. I take a bite. It's crisp, sharp, and full of promise. I toss one over the fence to Sarah. "It's a little sour," I say, a smile spreading across my face. "Needs another week, but yeah, it was worth it." From my porch, I can see Brenda Kravitz's house. This year, she didn't plant petunias. Her flower bed is now full of cacti. They're resilient, prickly, and don't need a lot of water. Some people, it seems, can learn a lesson after all.